Okay. So, good morning, everyone. This is Naveen Agarwal speaking from Imperial College, and I welcome you to the second live session. And we have two speakers, but from one from WRI, Mr. Deepak Krishnan, and Ms. Kanika Chawla from CEEW. And they'll be speaking about rooftop solar primarily. So so Deepak is going to take you through the give you an overview of the CNI customers for rooftop solar, and then Kanika is going to be covering the financing and risks associated with that, and touching upon those aspects. But before we begin, I'd Charlie, who's actually joining us from the US, I'd like him to say a few words, and then we can start with Deepak's presentation.
Yes, great. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Really glad to have you here for this second session. I'm indeed in the US on a family holiday, but work goes on as it must. And even though holiday comes, but this continues. So I'll be have a very limited role this week, but I want to make sure that I could be here to join you. Let me just say a couple of things about where we go from here. So these live sessions, as you know, we have 4 in total. This is now our second. Again, we'll just say a couple of things about the importance of staying connected to the material that's available on the hub, and really ask the session to check in with your own progress on that. It's really important. And the second is to make sure that you're having some interaction with your group. As you know, the final deliverable for the course and the way that we've really oriented all of the material is around that project, which really consolidates and hopefully gives a strong sense of why we're doing this class, which is a very tangible outcome of understanding how an example company can use corporate procurement and for its own benefit, both economic and in every sense. So with that, I'll just say welcome. Thank you for making time out of your schedules today to be here. As always, this recording will be available later for those that were unable to attend. And with that, I'll turn it over to Naveen.
Thank you, Charlie, for those words. And just to update you, in fact, we had our office hours yesterday, the first office hours for this course, and we had 8 participants actually coming in, and they had a couple of questions about their assignment, and I think we were able to get them started on that one. And it was actually, we also got some feedback in terms of the way the course was going, and the way that what they thought about the material and everything. And we also encouraged them actually to start interacting in the discussion forums. So before we begin, I'd like you guys to actually start participating and start interacting with each other, because that's the way the learning is going to actually develop. And so now it's my pleasure to actually welcome Deepak Krishnan from WRI. He's going to be talking about rooftop solar, and he will touch upon. He'll give you an overview of the entire segment in his presentation, as well as talk about some of the business models that are prevalent. Thank you, and over to you, Deepak.
Yeah, thanks, Naveen. Hello, everybody. It's my pleasure to be here, and this is my second year presenting to guys. Last year, I had the pleasure of doing this session along with Mr. Lakshminarayanan from Bangalore International Airport. And that time we covered the corporate procurement of solar that airport had done. So this is going to be a little more generic, looking at what's happening across the sector, and I will touch upon a couple of interesting developments which have happened. One which we have been involved in with a couple of industrial parks, and the other one is the Kusum scheme, under which one of the packages seems to be something of interest. Yeah, I'll go ahead. So all our work with corporate C&I renewable procurement is under this initiative called Green Power Market Development Group. It's a partnership between WRI and CII's Green Business Center. So it has been in existence since 2013, and our modus operandi has been we do the odd transaction support, either to demonstrate the feasibility of a policy, which is how we ended up working with the Bangalore airport immediately after the Karnataka open access policy regulations had come in place. Then demand aggregation, of which I'll talk more about towards the end of the presentation, is also something we have attempted to do right from the inception of this initiative. And policy advocacy is also something that we do through the steering committees that we have in different states. So this initiative has chapters in Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, Maharashtra, Telangana, and the NCR region. So what we do is we get groups of key representatives from the industry, the IPPs, who we get them to meet almost every quarter, and they deliberate about the prevailing situation, learn from each other's example, outline topics where further research or support is needed, post which the group as such takes these recommendations to government, regulators, or we also try to respond to different draft discussion papers or policies or regulations put out by the different agencies. And just a little bit more about what else we do is one is try and facilitate deals between different consumers and IPPs. So that has also been something we have been doing. So now jumping into the topic per se, and this is something I'm sure all of you will be aware of, but just to reiterate the message that even the percentage of consumption by C&I is dropping as the trend indicates, but overall it's still close to the 50% mark. So 50% of India's electricity consumption is with the C&I and this is something which and importance of this sector is quite clearly underlined by this. This volume of consumption is enough to actually convince utilities, regulators, and governments that the renewable energy needs of this segment needs to be catered for. And we have seen initiatives like this taking off in the US, for instance, where there is a group called the Renewable Energy Buyers Alliance, where through the efforts of the network and different companies also coming in and saying that if a particular state, if you don't give me renewable energy options either through open access or through the utility, we will consider taking our data center or industrial facility somewhere else. So that's the power of the C&I segment, and we have seen it significantly being exercised in the US. Just to give you a snapshot of what's happening in the rooftop solar segment, and again, this is something you would all be aware of, but just to reiterate the message, rooftop solar is growing consistently, and it's at about 25% of the overall capacity of projects which are, and this is all been captured in the Bridge to India report that they periodically issue. Now, within rooftop solar itself, the OPEX market share has been increasing over the last few financial years. Now, our understanding is that this may be because it is easier, particularly as an MNC or as a company who wants to be asset light, you would prefer that these rooftop solar assets are in the books of the developer, and it just seems to be a swapping of power source from the rooftop solar plant. So this is again a growing trend, and we have seen initial signs of this when MNCs in particular would balk at going ahead with capital expenditure projects. And there were lots of interesting cases also. For instance, even if a company, one of the companies we worked with wanted to enter into a 5-year PPA, folks at headquarters actually calculated the the overall value of the contract over 5 years, and then they said that this is the bulk investment we are looking at. So all sorts of things, but overall OPEX model is something as evident from this graph has been picking. Now C&I again dominates in this segment, and as this graph shows, 29% of the installations are more than 1 megawatt in size, and this share has actually been consistently growing over the last few years. Now, the industrial and commercial sector definitely has an advantage in this with the fact that more reliable suppliers are willing to come in and set up these plants, and the C&I segment as a whole is able to enforce these quality standards as well as performance standards. So on the residential side, we have had cases of consumers not being aware of what is the payback period of a rooftop project. They are not sure of whether the quality of the equipment. They are not aware about financing schemes, whereas that is not the case in the C&I segment with dedicated teams who are looking at all these aspects. And states, I'm sure you would all be tracking this, and the top 5, and within the top 5 you might see quite a bit of changes with positions relatively, but beyond these, I don't think this graph should come much of as a surprise for us. And even within these, even these leading states themselves have their own quirks. For instance, Maharashtra, there was over the last year, there was a case of someone coming up and saying that even if I have an open rooftop solar plant, it is being treated as an open access consumption, and cross subsidy utilities looking to levy cross subsidy charges. So while this segment is still small, it is starting to create problems and friction with the utilities. So working with the utility to resolve that should be something we should try to. And we also believe that utility-focused business models will also start emerging in the coming few years. For instance, AP and Karnataka, AP in fact has gone ahead and given approval to the DISCOMs for the utility-focused centered business models. Karnataka, I understand, had a draft discussion paper out about this, but not sure they have gone ahead and implemented. The Delhi DISCOMs have been very proactive in being at the center of pushing rooftop solar among consumers. But again, the effort in Delhi particularly seems to be a lot directed towards residential consumers. And if my memory serves me right, the AP case is also focused on the residential, but I'm happy to recheck that. And but ultimately, if you look at it from a theoretical perspective, having a utility-centered business model catering to C&I consumers makes most sense for the utility, because you're retaining your best-paying consumers within your network, and then look to have things like solarized feeders or folks shifting to solar at their own premises more for a residential and agricultural consumers, because they are the ones who are being subsidized. Now, the key drivers, and again, this would essentially be a reiteration of things which you all know, is there is a natural business case for C&I consumers, as I'll show in the next slide. Most of the states have their net and gross metering regulations in place. Of course, how much they adhere to it, how much they follow all that is a question, is a relative question. For instance, Tamil Nadu, though they have, under the new policy, they have something called net feed-in. Still, there is a shortage of net metering, net meters available in the market, as per the news that came out recently. So those kind of challenges are also there. Then, of course, one other driver has been the line of credit, which is announced by World Bank, ADB, and the BRICS Bank in association with SBI, PNB, and respectively. Now, this slide, it straightforward makes the case for rooftop solar. Now, if you look at what is the current LT industrial, commercial, similarly HT commercial tariffs across these 5 states, and look at what the utility sets as the rooftop solar benchmark rate. Of course, when it comes to a negotiation between the developer and the C&I, we would definitely, these rates may not be the ones that we finally settle upon, but just to give you an idea of where the cost economics are tending towards, you can definitely see that rooftop solar costs are much lesser than the tariff rates that you would pay as a C&I consumer. Now, having said that, the challenge is that you can't meet 100% of your requirement through rooftop solar. One, because the facility that you are in may not, and the power requirement that you have may not, it will not completely match. The other is that most of these states also have set caps on how much rooftop solar you can install, up to 80% of your connected load or up to 90% of your connected load. Some of these guys have a mechanism wherein they pay you the tariff, the rate that is set. The other states, they may adjust it across the next few months. Tamil Nadu in particular has disallowed HT consumers from participating in their net metering schemes for the new policy. So again, variations exist, and but overall, if you just take a numbers approach, this there is definitely a business case to be made. Now, if you also look at the lines of credit that these banks have issued, for instance, World Bank has seen significant traction. 38% of the committed amount has been disbursed, and they have also made a commitment to accelerate 3 large projects amounting to close to 180 millions. The other 2 lines of credits, that's ADB, PNB, GCF, NABARD, Tata Clean Tech, we are yet to hear about similar large-scale success stories, though there have been efforts made at 1 or 2 industrial plants. PNB, again, if I remember, they had facilitated a large rooftop solar plant somewhere in Haryana or Punjab. The BRICS facility is something we again haven't heard much about. GCF NABARD also has recently started, and we hope to hear about those projects also going forward. Now, challenges are galore in this sector, and at the risk of repeating something which came out a year or a year and a half ago, this was the Parliamentary Committee on Energy. The Standing Committee had put out these particular issues. So multiple approval process, the reluctance of DISCOMs to operationalize net metering because they are losing their high-paying consumers. Skill and knowledge gaps may not be as much as a challenge in C&I as much as it is in residential. The withdrawal of the subsidy, and by which this could be the accelerated depreciation, which was at 80%, has come down to 40%. Then again, slow progress of implementing agencies. This has been a key concern across many places. And then the frequent changes in these policies, and in general, a lack of clarity on how things would function if you do set up that particular plan. So one of the I'll just so this was the overall bird's eye view I wanted to give about the sector. And wanted to also highlight a couple of aggregation projects which we worked with. So the genesis for this was sometime back in 2014, where we worked with about 5 or 6 companies to create a single large bundle of demand for rooftop solar power. Now, the thing was that in Bangalore, these companies were not contiguously located, though they were under the same license area. And since it was a first attempt, we also had issues in convincing people about the benefits of participating, coming together, the possible economies of scale that could result. We also had challenges in balancing the bundle. How many of them wanted a capex model? How many of them wanted to go in for an opex model? Some of the companies were open to looking at both, depending on how the economics would work out for them. So we did go ahead and invite some tenders for this demand of about 3 megawatt across these 6 companies. But by the time the bids came in, the WTO case had also started and for the bidders were not willing to commit to the price they had quoted. They wanted to wait and watch. So that initiative kind of didn't see the light of day. But there were learnings that we picked up from it on how to structure these aggregation transactions better and how to convince companies going ahead. So more recently, we have seen this succeed at a couple of industrial parks, one in Aurangabad and the other in Ahmedabad, where more on the SME side and as a capex model, we have seen that these companies were willing to come together, and mainly from the perspective of a reduced rate for the solar power. And all of them entered into the capex model itself because they wanted to take advantage of the accelerated depreciation benefits before the end of the financial year. So we will be writing about these and releasing detailed case studies in the next 3-4 months. They should be out. I would be happy to share that with all of you. But the key lesson is it has worked as a capex model. On the OPEX side, we are yet to see some kind of success, wherein let's say a similar group of companies, a developer comes in and ends up just supplying power, but the asset sits on the books of the developer. That kind of model we haven't seen as of now. Hopefully, that's something we would be able to crack in the next operation. The last point I wanted to cover is also the distributed generation opportunities with Kusum. Now, this may not be a C&I buyer perspective, but from the perspective of RE developers, and even if some of you have businesses which look at RE setting up these generation plants. So the opportunity size is about 10,000 megawatts of grid-connected solar or energy-based power plants. There is an initial pilot of 1,000 megawatt that has been announced. So the size range is about 500 kilowatt to 2 megawatt range, and the entities that set this up are power generators. Typically, it has been defined as individual farmers or cooperatives, panchayats, and water use organizations. And the idea behind this distributed generation, one of the main ideas is to reduce your T&D losses. So therefore, they have initially defined a radius of 5 kilometers for substations. The DISCOM is supposed to notify these substations. I also list out what is the available capacity and invite applications against that. There is a prefixed levelized tariff in case the applications are below the level that is set up by the DISCOM. In case the available capacity is more, the DISCOM has to go in for bidding.
I'm going to interrupt you, Deepak. Great, in fact, thank you so much. There were actually a couple of very good questions. So I just thought that you'd like to kind of just touch upon those, and we will save, of course, some for a Q&A session at the end at the time. So in fact, like I think one query was regarding like the source of the CNI data, and there were some people who were actually really interested in what is the RE procurement from the Indian Railways. What are the models and especially like in Maharashtra, etc. And in fact, you were talking about like top 5 states. So one of the things that people touched upon, and in fact, I'm quite curious to understand myself in terms of what are the factors. What is it that actually makes like some states actually emerge as leading players in the rooftop solar market, and while others are not able to, like, because I think the federal policies, the central government policies kind of are quite generous in that respect and all that. So if you could touch upon those aspects, that would be wonderful.
Sure. So the source for the first one, the source for the C&I data is the energy statistics that is put out by the Ministry of Statistics, Planning and Implementation. So every year they come out with this energy statistics where they touch upon a wide range of like how much per consumer category fuel is consumed, how is the consumption of different fuels. Similarly, the electricity consumption by different consumer categories. So that is an annual thing, and I don't think they have released one as of this March. So most of the information that I've picked up is from the 2018 version that they have released. So as far as Indian Railways RE procurement is concerned, again, they are looking at both on-site and off-site models. And for the off-site, which they have experimented with the open access for sure. But at the same time, they have also applied for a deemed distribution licensee status. But the key challenge is that the railways is a nationwide network, and they traverse all the states in the country. And electricity distribution is a state subject, and therefore does the railways have to pick up licenses in each of the states that are there in India, or is there some kind of workaround that is possible? So to my knowledge, that issue has not been resolved, but issues related to open access with the railways, I think, have been far smoother. And I can check back on this and get back if there are particular questions, but I initially understand there were discoms which were trying to block this, but now that those blocks have been overcome and railways is able to procure open access. The on-site models are fairly simple, converting all their stations, putting rooftop solar on all their stations wherever possible. So that is a straightforward rooftop solar contract, similar to what most of state consumers be doing. Now, the third question is the most difficult, I would say. What makes some states lead, and what? So one of the main things which we think helps a state lead is the vision that the regulator has, and in this, competition plays a significant role. For instance, and again, this is an open access example that I'm giving here, but in case of Karnataka, when they came out with the open access regulation back in 2013, 2014, one of the reasons they said that they wanted to tap this third-party market was because the state was lagging behind the rest of the country in terms of installed solar. Now, going forward, what could possibly drive this is with the deteriorating finances that we are seeing at the utilities, they might want to see some of their lower paying consumers actually take up rooftop solar and reduce dependence on them so that they can focus more on the C&I consumers. So that could possibly also drive this market going forward. And in fact, some of the DISCOM officials been speaking to have actually asked what kind of models can they start to look at so that they meet the renewable energy requirements of C&I consumers and bring out different products. So the thinking has started within the DISCOMs. So that should hopefully drive these things going forward.
Great. Thank you so much, Deepak. I think that was a wonderful presentation, and we will have some time for questions towards the end. But before we do that, we'd like to just get on with Kanika's presentation. So, Deepak, if you put your screen share, and Kanika, can you hear me? Kanika, are you there? Kanika is here.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, wonderful. Yes.
Okay, super. Sorry. Let me just share my screen.
Great. So Kanika is going to jump right in, and she's going to talk about the financing aspect and the risks associated, and then she will also touch upon a couple of business models and some PPA. Okay, over to you, Kanika. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I think just taking forward from where Deepak left it. So good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are. I'm going to talk a little bit more broadly about the state of the renewable energy sector and some of the non-project risks that plague the flow of capital and how that affects different business models and how can we innovate across sort of the regulatory policy and business model and financial design to overcome some of these challenges. So very quickly, I work at the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. We're a research and policy institution based in New Delhi, and we work on a multitude of issues, but the areas that I work on are predominantly renewable energy and on energy finance. And we have a recent initiative called the Center for Energy Finance that we've just launched. And actually, the work that we do at the Center for Energy Finance is very similar to some of the things that I'll be talking about today, which is around what is the value proposition of investing in renewables and what are some of the risks that plague that. And so that takes me right into this, the factors that determine the returns on investment. And I think that we spend a lot of our time thinking about what is the policy environment, what are the regulatory challenges, but some of the questions that were addressed to Deepak as well around why certain states are acting as sort of front runners versus others. And I think one predominant reason for that is also because the economics in some states is better than in others, right? And so in that context, that all comes down to what will be your returns on investment, and sometimes that is specific. It's different in different parts of the country and definitely in different parts of the world. So I like to think about the returns on investment being a function of many things, but one is what is the cost that you have to incur, and that is the cost that you incur are a function of the availability of finance. What is the cost at which you're able to access that capital, how much capital is available, but then also the availability of things like land. What is the cost of land? What is the cost of the infrastructure, availability of infrastructure? So there is all the costs which you can see on the screen on the top right-hand corner. And then, of course, the revenues, which is really the sale of power, the cost at which you sell the power, and then the timeliness with which you receive your receivables, and then basically other charges along the ecosystem which you may or may not have to pay in different parts of the country, right? But then there's also on the other side of, and this is something that's in the news a lot today, so I would be preaching to the choir when I talk about the ease of doing business. In the context of renewables, this is very important because one of the things that we celebrate a lot is the ability of renewable energy to create new jobs. But we don't talk enough about that in the absence of a skilled and available workforce in the right regions where the capacity is going to be deployed, this could also be an impediment. So it's both an opportunity as well as an impediment. And then, of course, operational ease. And again, some states have single window clearances, you have solar parks, and so they enable the deployment of renewables, whereas in others, even things like net metering, while the policy may exist, some of the clearances, etc., take a very long time, and then that results in some being more RE friendly than others. But really, in all of this, the bit that I find most fascinating is even though when you think about renewable energy, and in most cases, when you think about any high technology infrastructure project, we often think of the largest cost coming from the cost of technology. And the recent decline that we have seen in solar as well as wind tariffs, we've attributed that to gains in the technology costs, or basically the opposite of that, which is really that the cost of technology has gone down. There's a learning curve of technology, and so that is why prices have gone down. This is partially true, but what we find actually is that the largest proportion of the cost of a single unit of renewable power is actually the cost of finance. And so this analysis which you're seeing now is actually now an outdated bid. It was India's first sub 5 rupee bid. And what we found is that as much as 70% of that was the cost of servicing your debt and paying returns to equity investors. And the cost of technology was actually asymptotic to zero. Today, when we see the new 2 rupee 44 paisa bids, this picture is not much different. 60% of the cost of that is your cost of finance, and technology costs are lower, but really any incremental gain, if you think about, you're at 2 rupee 44 paisa or at about 4 cents, any future gain in this is not going to come from any significant changes in the cost of technology because that's already such a small proportion, but from the cost of capital. So then the logical question to ask is, why is the cost of capital high? And then there's a standard cost of capital, and then on top of that there is the risks that are perceived by the banks. So this is what is called the risk premium, right? And so the risk premium is a function of several country risks as well as specific renewable energy sector risks. So the first one, which we talk about a lot in India, is offtake risk, which is usually delays in payment. We haven't really seen any defaults yet. But an inordinate delay, in my mind, should qualify as a default. I mean, if you're seeing 9 months, 12-month delays, if you're negotiating what kind of discounting you will accept on your receivables just to receive your receivables, that some would argue should qualify as a default. So basically, if your receivables are under risk, then you're going to have to pay a premium while borrowing, right? Curtailment risk, as the share of renewable energy goes up in the overall electricity mix, we're going to see more curtailment. This is just a technical concern, and as the transmission infrastructure continues to need upgrades, curtailment risk continues to rise. Again, the availability of capital is a challenge. In India, we have a great dependence on bank debt, but as we move towards needing to diversify our sources of debt and especially look towards foreign capital, which is often available at lower prices, currency risk poses a big problem. And if you add a currency hedge on top of the borrowing risk, you're basically better off borrowing in country. And then there's land acquisition, construction risk, things like quality of panel, etc., which is a risk of doing business, and that is inherent and in the control of the developer for the most part, and is similar also to other infrastructure projects. So I won't go into too much detail. And then there's policy uncertainty and change in law risk, which I'll discuss a little bit more in the context of what the PPAs can do to address that. So as you all know, the power purchase agreement, in most cases, between the distribution companies and the power producers, but also increasingly we're seeing power purchase agreements between corporate off-takers or really anybody in that above 150 kilowatt additional sort of space, not consumer solar, but all other kinds of renewables would have a power purchase agreement. These power purchase agreements are legal contracts. They're entered into for a period of 20 to 25 years in most cases, but can often be shorter. But the terms of these contracts in the Indian context have not been standardized. So we know some of the clauses that work and some of them that don't. And the electricity regulators have been very clear on the kinds of privileges as well as some of the constraints that will be placed on different types of electricity. It's all governed by the Electricity Act. And so it is actually not difficult to standardize these. But in the absence of standardization and with every tender being slightly differentiated from the next, there is a very high due diligence required for each of these power purchase agreements. That said, the power purchase agreement is still the document of record and importance in the renewable energy sector, but the correct enforcement of PPAs can actually address several risks. So it can address the offtake risk in the form of, like, if the PPA can already build in, what will be the penalties if there is a delay in payment, for instance, right? It can cover curtailment risk in a very similar way, and there's an example of this having been done in the case of the Rewa solar park in Madhya Pradesh, where there is what we call the deemed generation clause, where if there is the developer or the independent power producer needs to, of course, forecast and present a day-ahead schedule of how much electricity they will generate, and if they are in violation of it, they have to pay a penalty. This is something that many states around the country are now adopting. But equally, on the flip side of this, there is that if there is a curtailment of the power that has been scheduled and agreed upon, and if for any reason the dispatch manager is unable to integrate all the renewable electricity that is generated at that time, there should be a penalty that should be paid to the independent power producer as well. So this deemed generation clause would address that curtailment risk and should be introduced in more contracts than we have seen. But the Rewa example is also proof of concept. And then there is a lot of this policy uncertainty that we have seen in recent times. This can be in the form of fiscal changes like GST, or more recently the safeguard duties, etc. And the change in law clause basically says that there will be in case of a change in any regulatory or a policy or fiscal incentive or initiative after the contract has been entered into, then there will be a pass-through mechanism which will take the independent power producer back to the financial and economic condition that they were in if that change had not been made. So basically, to use an example, in the case of a safeguard duty, if panels are now costing the independent power producers more than they had anticipated, that additional amount will be passed on into the tariff that they would receive in the form of receivables from their counterparty, right? So the PPAs are actually a very powerful tool. They can also, I mean, the PPA is also the document that you use in the case of any appeal that you file in front of APTEL or in front of any judicial authority. And while there needs to be some more work done in strengthening the PPAs, not just in sort of implementation, but also in terms of spirit of the clauses, right? So you can't just go and keep appealing everything. The spirit of the PPA also needs to be upheld. And the recent example of what we're seeing in Andhra Pradesh around renegotiation, etc., is really a violation of that spirit. But also to think about how do you sensitize the different regulatory authorities in doing a fast track sort of redressal of complaints or of any disputes that may arise, and for having also special judicial benches that can maybe do a sort of take an aggressive timeline approach in addressing some of the grievances that arrive. And this is predominantly because renewable energy, unlike thermal energy, has a much faster feedback loop. And because of the declining tariffs, what we're seeing is that the amount of time or the delays in payments or curtailment, etc., can result in NPAs and can result in stress assets much more rapidly in the renewable sector than in the thermal sector. So there really isn't time to keep litigating things endlessly as we have seen in the thermal sector, because you're also, if you were to think about renewable energy companies, even though they're growing, if you compare them to NTPC, it's really a David versus Goliath kind of comparison. So that based on that, again, this is something that we share in common also with the WRI, and then it was reflective also in Deepak's presentation, which is how do you drive the sector towards more evidence-based decision making as opposed to just anecdotal decision making. And in order to do that, data, in our view at CEW, is very critical to addressing some of this risk perception. So there is the need to address the real risks, but also it's important to address the data gap and build coherent narratives for the sector. So in order to do that, what I'm going to now present is really a state of the sector. A lot of these things you may have known about, but you may not have known, you may know it anecdotally, you may also know it intuitively, but you may not know it quantitatively. So I will present these slides quite quickly because you have the slides and you can sort of pore over them, and I'd be happy to answer questions later on as well. But really, I'd just like to discuss a few of the trends in the sector more recently, right? So what we're seeing is greater market concentration. This happens really across sectors as sectors gain in maturity. Some companies sort of come out on top and they end up, there's a lot of merger and acquisitions and downstream secondary activity, which results in consolidation. But also what we are finding is that there's a lot of churn in who are the big players. So what happened, like the people who emerge out to be big players in year one may not necessarily be big players in year two. And a lot of this goes back to the ability of developers to access capital. And their ability to access capital also, of course, is a function of how much assets they have, what is their cash flow ratios, their diversification of their assets, etc., all of that. But broadly, the message to take away here is that there is market consolidation happening. There are a few players that control more than 80% of the overall market, but each year the players who are coming out on top are changing. And while that churn was sort of higher, I would say, in the wind sector in previous years. In the last 1 year, we have seen more stabilization, and we know very clearly who are the main players, but there continues to be some change in that. The much more interesting finding, though, is that as the market is maturing, the risk perception from debt financiers is going down. And this is, of course, very good news, because this means you can now borrow for renewable energy at lower prices. The spreads have gone down by as much as 75 to 125 basis points, which is significant in just a 5-year period. And also the capital structures are changing, which basically means you can now leverage your equity much more. So you can have a smaller share of equity and a larger share of debt, so which is really good. The graph on the bottom left looks like there are very sharp movements happening. This is because if you actually look at the scale, it's really 72, 73, right? So it looks like the impact has been magnified in the representation. It's a much more gradual change, but it is good news overall that you're now able to borrow more and you're able to borrow cheaper. You're also able to borrow for longer. And this is very critical, because the way that renewable energy assets work there is that they have quite long timelines. The PPAs also last for a long time. And again, in this context, that the fact that you are now able to have longer tenure loans, both for solar and wind, is very helpful. If in most cases, actually, you are now able to have longer tenure loans if as a private power producer for solar and wind than for thermal. So state-backed power producers, say like NTPC and others, are of course still able to have access to longer tenures. But if you actually look at this graph, the other thing that the slide doesn't say, but is in my mind the most interesting takeaway, is that the thermal graph, which is in red, doesn't actually have any data points in 2017 and 18. And this is because no private IPP was given any fresh line of credit in 2017 and 18. So they continue to be on the books of banks in lines of credit that they've received in the past. But private IPPs are finding it very difficult to raise debt in the Indian market. And this is really, in some ways, something that the renewable energy sector can be both proud of or be blamed for, that they've displaced the power sector exposure or the new power sector exposure that banks take, because they continue to actually have on their books large thermal exposure from the past. Solar parks, and this is where I come to sort of, what are the kinds of policy and regulatory innovations that can drive a change. Solar parks are really one such way. What we see is that a lot of the new tendering happening in recent times is happening in solar parks. So even though there was a slowdown in 2018, 2017 saw a majority of the capacity being sanctioned in parks. And what we also see is that a lot of the international investment comes in parks. This is intuitive because parks actually offer you a plug and play model. All clearances are done. Infrastructure for evacuation is available to you on your doorstep. And so international IPPs find it quite easy, and international investors are also assured of sort of at least no construction and operational risk, even if there continue to be other risks. Again, the big announcement of the 100 gigawatt, but also how that's played out, and very clear tendering capacity schedule has helped in the size of projects going up. This has resulted in economies of scale, and therefore obviously has resulted in declining prices. However, the flip of this, and which is the slightly unhappy part of the story, which the slide does not tell you, is as you go to larger and larger project sizes, your job creation footprint actually goes down. And again, that's logical because of economies of scale, but it's, if you want to optimize for cost and have lowest tariffs, then of course you need to have larger size projects, and again that's where parks and clear policy signals come in place. But if you want to create a lot of jobs, and you also want to have a more decentralized burden on the transmission network, which eases integration, etc., then this is clearly not the right approach. And then the approach that we are taking is much more towards large infrastructure and taking renewables as a large infrastructure class. This is again, the credit worthiness of the counterparty is critical. This goes back to the risk that I was talking about around offtake risk. And if you were to correlate this with the presentation that Deepak made, this is also why there is a lot more activity happening around corporate offtake and non-discom offtake. It could even be residential consumers or whatever else. And even if discom were to be sort of the arbiter of that residential consumption, discoms already have a downstream demand pipeline for the renewable energy assets that they would commission. So the quality of your counterparty, who will be the consumer of the renewable power, is essential to determining the flow of investment. And now I'm just going to leave you with a few slides which you can also look at later, which really are a supplement to the discussion in the first few minutes of today's live session, which was around what are the business models that work. The business models that Deepak talked about were for the SME and corporate and CNI sector. These are some of the work that we're doing with distribution companies in Delhi, and these are the 3 business models that we're about to pilot, which allow residential consumers to become a part of the energy transition and become demand centers for renewable energy. So I will stop with that. Thank you very much for your attention.
Kanika, hi, it's Charlie Donovan. I'll just maybe invite you, I'd say a couple things now, but invite you to have a look at the chat that's been going on during your presentation, because lots of very detailed questions there. So maybe you'd like to just look through that for a moment and see a few things that you'd like to respond to. I'll just say, as a way of reflecting on what's been said, is that this has been a lot of information, and there's definitely some people involved in the seminar who are very much at the cutting edge of this market, and I can see from what's being said on the chat, very, very aware of all that's going on. But I also want to say, for the people who are maybe coming into this relatively new, we want to make sure that we don't operate at too fast a speed, because there is a lot of some of the basic terminology and concepts that can be very confusing here. And I'll just say one, which is that, what we've seen in the international space is that renewables that operates in these different markets, so rooftop versus utility scale, and even the subsegments within them, there are very different players that are suited for that. And so we have seen very little crossover actually to date, and between those segments. And I think that the big reason is that when you get into rooftop, you're talking about a very, very different set of competencies in terms of what's needed for the company that's going to support deployment for the customer in rooftop, which is much more around maintenance, much more around grid integration, much more around payments than it is about in the utility scale, which would be, as you alluded to, much more of a access to finance, large-scale procurement, these kinds of competencies. So, these are very different buckets, and I think that one thing we need to make sure that we do as we go on in this course is it's very easy to start to have one big conversation about all, the entirety of the opportunity, but there's some really, really important distinctions about how each of these work. And when a particular corporate is looking at mixing, let's say, a different tactics, they're very likely to be dealing with different players and having to adopt a slightly different mindset about how they think about whether the thing's going to be on their roof or whether it's going to be away from the site and being procured more virtually. So I just say that it's not unique to India at all, that there would be some confusion and difficulty in integrating these concepts, because we have not seen many instances where where players are able to span those categories, at least span them in a way that would be kind of coherent to the customer. So with that, maybe Kanika, just invite you to respond to some of the questions that resonate for you that you've seen in the chat.
So I mean, a lot of the questions really are around what's happening with the renegotiation of or the potential renegotiation of contracts and in Andhra Pradesh. And I think that, of course, there's already a stay order from the Andhra Pradesh High Court that we'll see where that goes. I think that beyond a point, this is really a burden this is really country risk. There's very little that the sector can do on its own. But that being said, I believe that based on past experiences as well, that the court will eventually uphold contract. I mean, we are not a banana republic, so we don't have to really be that concerned about it. What we need to be very concerned about, though, if I was a independent power producer that had an ongoing PPA, I would know that it's really I'd have to battle it out, but I will eventually get paid, and my contract will be honored. That being said, though, the people who should be concerned are the market entrants, and including the power producers who want to continue building pipeline. Because what this does is it scares investors away, and those investors are not coming back. Because even though India offers it offers the largest renewable energy market anywhere in the world that actually operates on market principles. But if you are going to have sort of very basic risk like contract risk and not allow guarantees like MEGA to operate in the country, that makes it very difficult then, especially for more conservative investors who are able to, like institutional investors, pension funds, etc., to then take a position in renewable energy projects. So I think that there's something, and I know that the central government of India is taking a keen and critical view of the actions that are taking place in Andhra Pradesh, and they're critical of it, and they're keen to resolve it, and they're supporting the power producers. But, it's really I feel like some of the damage has been done, and unless we take a very strong view on this, we are going to scare investors away permanently. Then there's some questions here around what do you do with the non-payment and delays by discoms affecting and like NPA risk. I feel like I covered this in a fair bit of detail. The credit, there are synthetic fiscal solutions that can be adopted, and they can be with public money, they can be with private money, and then they can be in the form of guarantees, insurance products, and they can be specific. So they can say you can have an escrow account which say state governments pay into, given that most of the off-takers are owned by their sort of subunits of the state government, even though there are some private ones, but I think that defaults by private and delays by private ones are anyway lower. So they can be escrow accounts that can be used. They can be first loss kind of systems. Again, underwriting. And I think as Deepak answered the question around REWA, that it was a special project because it had this kind of underwriting where the state government had underwritten the counterparty risk. And there was not just, a letter of credit, but also other additional de-risking mechanisms. The solution for Madhya Pradesh may not be the solution for every part of the country or for every single counterparty, but there can be versions of the same. And I think that just goes back to the innovation required, both in business models as well as in financial design. So there is risk. That risk needs to be shared because in its current form, there are several investors who don't have that risk appetite. So who's willing to share it, and how do you design that? These are very workable solutions. There just has to be I would say like a will to be a market participant and, to accept that these are real problems and that we will resolve them. But how you resolve them is actually not that complicated.
Kanika, let me ask a question or pose a question that was on the chat and also invite, perhaps as a way of bringing the session towards a close, invite Deepak also to reflect on this, which is there was a comment on the chat that very interesting about seeing that in the first presentation about how some of the benchmark tariff rates for the rooftop sector were kind of all over the place, and it's surprising because you would expect over time as a market starts to settle down, really the thing that should be driving those headline rates should be nothing more than the amount of solar irradiation that's available at any site. So clearly that's not the case yet, and so maybe invite both of you just to share in terms of all these factors. And I thought that was a very interesting slide trying to consolidate the major factors that are driving deployment. Maybe if you could just kind of indicate your top one or two issues that the folks that are participating in this seminar, when they start to look at a procurement plan for a corporate, what's the issue that really seems to be driving some of that variation in whether the economics end up being correct, and in turn would become an area that the groups will need to really investigate in a lot of depth in order to get clear where those economics work at specific sites and for specific companies.
Deepak, did you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So out of the states that I had listed out, at least in the more recent times, only Karnataka and maybe Maharashtra seem to be following the economic model of determining that feed-in tariff. So they take into account the capex, the opex, the financing costs, and then they arrive at the final tariff. Tamil Nadu, Andhra have been very ad hoc with that, especially Tamil Nadu. They have and those are more DISCOM protection measures. That's the sense I'm getting, because linking it to the average power procurement cost, which itself is determined separately, and then in the case of Tamil Nadu, saying that it will only be the feed-in tariff for any excess electricity generation is only some 75% of that average power procurement cost. So in those cases, it is purely to ensure that the DISCOM pays out as less as possible. But Karnataka and Maharashtra, to an extent, have still been adhering to economic principles when determining the feed-in tariffs.
So from my side, I would just say that, when that decision making about should I have a rooftop system, and what would be the factor that would drive that, and I would say, of course, it is like the potential and the irradiation, Charlie, as you mentioned, but really beyond that, I would say what is the opportunity cost, which is the tariff that I would have to pay, which also varies from state to state. But eventually it would also be what are the different kinds of financing mechanisms that are available to me, because that changes your economics significantly. If I have to pay for everything up front, that is very different from if I can do sort of an on-bill kind of model, or versus if you do, some kind of leasing model. So there's so many, and Deepak talked about these in detail. So I think that as a result of that, the economics become more or less compelling as a function of that as well.
That's great. Thank you. We've come to the end of the hour, so let me say thank you very much to the two speakers. As we did previously, we'll make those presentations available, allow people with a bit more time to go back through what's a lot of very good research that both organizations have been doing in this space. So really appreciate you sharing that with us. Let me just look ahead to the next session, to the live session, as we start to get, what we'll try to do now is in a lot of ways, this issue that Kanika mentioned so clearly about financing, we're going to, through the material that's available on the hub, and then as we go into the next live session, try to back up a couple of steps there and just consider some of the basic definitions again around debt and equity, how they combine, where those sources of capital are coming from, what advantages they provide, and some of the complexities in making optimal capital structures for these projects. So that's very much an issue that we're going to dive deeper into on the next session. And again, really welcome people to reach out. We're moving at a very quick pace in this course, and either to myself or to Naveen, very happy for if there's any supplemental information that people think that they need to get their heads around some of the stuff that we're discussing. Always, please don't be afraid to reach out to us and ask for that support. So again, let me thank the speakers and to you all for making time for this session. We'll look forward to speaking with you again next week. And certainly look forward to hearing from you either through the office hours that Naveen has set up to respond to individual questions, or by email in between. So with that, I wish you a very good rest of your day. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.